Now that we have the design, we know what we're building, and we have all of our measurements, we know what we're going to need for materials. Now we have to select the materials. But before we select the materials, I want to talk a little bit about wood movement, moisture content. These are really important things because wood moves. You just have to accept that and understand it. You can't defy the laws of physics. Hydraulic pressure is amazing, and it will break apart your pieces if you don't pay attention to the laws of physics and how wood moves. Now, here's a real quick drawing of a tree. We have annual rings on the tree. We're looking at the end grain of the tree. And the tree moves around those annual rings. In other words, when the tree expands or shrinks, it's around these annual rings. So the tree grows to the outside and then shrinks back down. When we cut lumber, we end up with a number of different types of cut. The first one we get is kind of right through the middle of the tree. We don't go absolutely in the center, but we go on either side of the tree when we're sawing a log if you have a good sawyer. And we end up with two pieces on either side of the center of the tree. The center of the tree is called the pith of the tree, and it's pretty much useless. You try to avoid pith whenever you can. But this is called quarter sawn lumber. And quarter sawn lumber is your most stable lumber. Quarter sawn lumber, true quarter sawn lumber, is when the grain of the tree is 90 degrees to the face of your board. Now, since the tree shrinks along the annual rings, and all of these annual rings are the same length, this will shrink very uniformly. It'll shrink for thickness, it'll shrink very little for width, and it won't cup or twist, because all of these shrink the same amount. It just gets a little thinner as it dries out. So then we move a little bit further outside the tree, and we get something that out on this outside edge, we have wood that's going roughly 45 degrees. Now, and again, we're moving along our annual rings as this wood shrinks. And it won't be quite as stable as a quarter sawn where you just simply lose evenly along the thickness. This will turn the board into just a little bit of a parallelogram as it shrinks. Again, it'll shrink evenly along these lines. A lot of times the wood, these lines, these annual rings will vary a little bit in size as they get closer to the end of the board. You may get a little more flat. But again, a very, very stable wood. It's resistant to cupping and twisting, not as much as a quarter sawn, but it's pretty good. But one thing that this rift sawn, and we'll do this quarter, and this is rift, R-I-F-T, rift sawn. The nice thing about rift sawn is because the grain is basically 45 degrees to the surface, the face of the board, it's also 45 degrees to the edge of the board. So you have the same grain face on all four sides. This is really good for things like corner posts on a piece of furniture, legs on a piece of furniture, where you want to see that same grain face. You don't want to go from flat sawn to quarter sawn on it because of the difference in the appearance of the grain. It looks like two different boards. Rift sawn will give you that uniformity of grain on both sides. And it also gives you a really nice, clean, fine grain. You don't have some of the demonstrative grain of quarter sawn. The last cut, and the one that we see most often, is something called flat sawn. And flat sawn is where you have the nice smiley faces of your annual rings. This is the least stable of the wood. Different cuts. It's what we see most of the time when we go to a big box store to look at lumber, or we go to your hardwood lumber dealers. You're going to see flat sawn lumber. The problem with flat sawn lumber is because the wood shrinks along these annual rings, if this shrinks 10% in volume, 10% of that annual ring that's really short towards the end here isn't a big deal. 10% of this long annual ring is a really big deal. So that will shrink quite a bit less than this smaller annual ring, and then we end up with a board that does this. It's going to shrink because of the way that annual ring condenses. So this is the most stable, this is the most uniform as far as grain face goes, and this is the least stable. Now, not saying that flat sawn is a problem with furniture building. It's just that it's going to have the possibility of more dimensional instability. It's going to move around more. To overcome a lot of that is the moisture content in the wood. Now, drying wood, of course, is really important. You really need to use kiln-dried wood. Kiln-dried wood means that the wood has been dried artificially down to probably 6 or 7%, something in that area. When it's dried that dry, there are cells in the wood, heavy-walled cells, that are very resistant to water moving through them. They're the cells that keep the moisture in the tree when it's live, even in real dry conditions. It forces the moisture out of those cell walls. They collapse. The lignin, which is the glue that holds the wood fibers together, solidifies, and then those cells can't take in moisture anymore. The wood will still take in moisture through seasonal changes, humidity changes, but it takes it in more around and through the fibers of the wood rather than the cell walls, the tough cell walls of the wood. So you really want kiln-dried wood because that becomes more dimensionally stable. But along with kiln-dried, you want your wood to reach something called EMC, equilibrium moisture content. Every species of wood will hold a certain amount of water at a certain humidity and temperature. And once it stabilizes in its environment, it is very comfortable. It's not going to move around a lot. You can find charts on what EMC is for the specific species at temperature and humidity. You can get a moisture meter like this Wagner Orion that will show you what your EMC should be for that lumber. But the big thing is you want to get your lumber into your shop. If it's a critical piece that you're working on, you want to get that lumber in a couple of weeks before you're going to build whatever piece you're building to allow it to reach equilibrium moisture content in that area that you're working. Now, of course, the humidity and temperature are going to vary in there, but once it's reached EMC, all of the lumber has reached EMC, it will expand and contract uniformly as basically, you might say, a unit. And so it's important to have adequate lumber for your project, very adequate. You can figure on at least 25% over what you need if you're doing a little bigger project, because you're going to have waste from cutting it, sawing it, planing it, doing all the different things. And I usually tend to err on the side of having a lot of lumber on hand that is at EMC, simply because if I make a mistake and I need to bring a new piece of lumber in, the lumber that I've got in my shop, I have chosen for the project, it is at EMC, and I can just grab another board. It's the grain pattern that I want, it's the color that I want, and I can continue on working. If I run short and I have to go out to my storage area, well, the storage area is at a different humidity than my shop, so that wood won't be at EMC. It will move. And if I machine it right away, then the chance of warping or twisting is enhanced simply as the wood reaches EMC in the shop. It can move. So it's really important to understand what your wood movement is and to make sure that the wood has been dried at one time, at least it's been kiln dried, and then allow it to get to EMC. Now this project we're working on, we're working with a fair amount of plywood, so we don't have to worry about EMC with that. And the dividers that we're working with are fairly narrow dividers. They're 5/16 of an inch thick in material, and it's all quarter sawn. So it's going to be a very stable wood. It will reach EMC real quickly, and you're not going to have much warpage with it. So you can hurry the process a little bit when you're dealing with quarter sawn wood, simply because you know it's only going to move for thickness. Now another thing about grain direction is grain direction really tells you, your end grain really tells you what you're looking at on a piece of lumber. You go to a lumber yard and hopefully you can pick your lumber. If you go to a big box store, you can still pick it. You just won't have probably as much of a variety. But one thing you want to keep in mind is the density of the annual rings. Now we'll just use a flat sawn example here, flat sawn board. And you look at the board and you've got annual rings on it that some of them are very tight, close spaced, and some of them are far apart. This is a tree that probably had a lot of water, a lot of sunlight, grew very fast, and it's got big gaps between the annual rings. Big growth every year. This is a board that represents something that grew in an area where maybe it didn't get as much sunlight, didn't get as much moisture, it grew a lot slower. Some people will call that old growth wood, and it is. It takes a lot longer to grow a board when it's just putting on a little bit of material every year. But the big thing is you wouldn't want to put those two boards together in a project, simply because every one of those annual rings is a cathedral in that board. And the cathedral, what we're talking about, the cathedrals are these loops that make a board look like a board when we're looking at the face of a flat sawn board. You have a lot of cathedrals in here, you're going to have a lot of annual rings, you're going to have a lot of cathedrals. In a board that is fast growing, you're going to have very few cathedrals. What that does is this wood is going to be a lot darker than this wood with the dark annual rings. You're going to have a higher density of annual rings. It's going to be darker. Over here you're going to have a lower density of annual rings. It's going to be lighter. And the whole figure of the wood looks dramatically different. Putting those two boards side by side just doesn't look real good. So when I go to choose my lumber, I have a cut list that I've determined all the different cuts, whether I want quarter sawn, whether I want rift sawn or flat sawn is going to be okay. And I have board footage of the different types of lumber that I want to look for. And the very first thing I do, I go to that lumber pile and I start looking at the end grain. You want to be able to see what that end grain looks like, the density, the patterns. That way you can pick efficiently. If you've got a big pile of lumber, and if the lumberyard is nice enough to allow you to pick from it, you don't want to have to tear that whole pile apart looking for specific faces. You can look at the end grain and you can pretty much determine what the face of that board is going to look like. So you can mark that board as one that you want to look at. Then when you start to take the pile apart to get at that board, you know where you're going. You don't have to keep sorting the lumber. You just pull it apart, grab the boards you want, neatly stack it back together so that you're the lumberyard's friend and you're off and running. When I store my lumber, I always clean cut the end of it so that I can see the annual rings. I mark the species on it and I mark the length of the wood. That way I can look at my wood rack and very quickly pick out the boards that I want to look at. Now a lot of times when you go to a lumberyard, if you're going to a big box store, you can always pull out a bunch of boards and stack them up and look at the end grain, look at the face grain and figure it out. The problem is a lot of times you don't have a lot of variety in a big box store, so it's hard to pick exactly what you want. A good, true lumberyard, hardwood lumberyard especially, is your best friend, especially on a bigger project. Once you get the different varieties of wood you want, the different cuts of wood, then you start looking at color. You want the color to be fairly homogeneous. Now, this project that we're working on is pretty much a utility project. It's going to go in your shop. I'm not real fussy about color with that. I want things to look uniform. I want them to match. But if there's some light and dark, as long as it's not one or two pieces scattered here and there, I'm not worried about it. I want, the dividers to be mostly dark. I'll want other pieces. If I can't find the dark wood to match, I'll use some lighter wood, but kind of segregate it. Don't mishmash it. If you're laminating up a panel, don't put a darker wood or something that has more color next to something that has less color. It's really important. And if you're laminating a panel, make sure the grain direction is all the same on the various pieces that you're putting together. Because when we look at a board, we look at one angle, we're looking down into the pores of the wood. That's called the end grain. We're looking against the grain. We flip that board around and look at it from the other way. Now we're looking at the back of those cells and they deflect the light or scatter the light. So you have two different looks from one way to the next. So make sure that the grain's going all the same direction, or else you're going to end up with a panel and when you get light on it, it's going to look striped because you're looking at the wood from two different directions. And if you start hand planing your panels and hand planing anything you've laminated up, you get real good at that real quick, because one time of having the grain reversed on it, it's just miserable to hand plane. So these are the important aspects of picking lumber. Now in a little project like this, it's probably not as crucial, but it's really important to get into the habit of paying attention to that wood every time you build a project. because it does become a habit. It becomes something that you just automatically do. A little bit of time up front pays. It pays in the long run because your project is going to look better, it's going to stay together better, and it's just going to be a lot nicer to work with. So wood grain, it's important.